Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ariel Avgar, and I'm the director of the ILR Center for Applied Research on Work at Cornell University. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Caro-sponsored webinar, Digging Deeper into Economic Anxiety Beyond Unemployment and Inflation Rates. The Center for Applied Research on Work was launched 2 years ago with the goal of serving as a hub for rigorous research related to labor and employment that informs action by a broad array of audiences outside of academia, policymakers, practitioners, and the public. Academia has always struggled with the link between theory and practice. Efforts to translate research into applied and useful tools and information have been mixed in terms of their efficacy. This is a real significant problem since there's arguably never been a time in which the link between research and practice has been more needed and more important. Confronting the myriad of tectonic shifts facing workers, unions, and organizations, from the proliferation of AI-related technologies to the shift in how and where work is conducted, will all require policies and practices that are capable of meeting this moment. The research that we conduct at ILR has relevance far beyond the scholarly communities that we engage with. And the Center for Applied Research on Work is experimenting with novel ways of making sure that our research informs and drives action. A necessary first step in informing and driving action calls for an accurate portrait of the realities facing communities, workers, and their families. What are the pain points and challenges facing New York residents, for example? Today's webinar provides a window into the economic and employment realities shaping perceptions and behaviors. We will learn about core documented themes that emerge from a number of different data sources. A few thanks before turning the floor over to Dr. Anne-Marie Brady. First, our work at ILR benefits in profound ways from New York State partnership and support. We have attendees from state government, and it offers me an opportunity to express my deep appreciation for this support and partnership. I know that our very own Assembly member, Anna Kellis, is registered for this webinar, as are colleagues from the legislature and DOL. We're grateful for all that you do on behalf of workers and their families in New York State, and for all that you do to support ILR. A big thanks to Ann DeCecco for her work planning and guiding these webinars alongside everything else she does at Caro. Thanks to Cassidy Stanley for her terrific logistical support. Many thanks to the members of our Empire State Poll team, who are an amazing group of researchers seeking to find ways to translate ILR research in meaningful ways and who've been instrumental in planning this webinar. Thanks to Dr. Anne-Marie Brady, who will be moderating today's session, and a very big thanks to our esteemed panelists who will be introduced by Dr. Brady. Finally, thanks to all of you for joining and engaging with us around this important topic. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Anne-Marie.
Great. Thanks so much, Ariel, for the introduction. As Ariel mentioned, my name is Anne-Marie Brady, and I'm the Research Director for Worker Rights and Equity at the ILR Worker Institute. I'm so pleased to be moderating this discussion today. On behalf of the Center for Applied Research on Work at the ILR School, I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar that will present on important findings from 3 surveys. We'll start with Dr. Russell Weaver, Research Director at the ILR School's Buffalo CoLab, who will present on the 2024 findings from the Empire State Poll that is administered by Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. We will then hear from Therese Daly, who is President and CEO of the United Way of New York State. She will present on findings from the 2023 ALICE survey. ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, but Employed, and is a set of measures that seeks to shine light on and understand the living standards of households with income above the poverty level, but less than the basic cost of living in 33 states and the District of Columbia. Dr. Jeff Larimore, economist and section chief at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, will present on the 2024 National Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making, otherwise known as SHED data. The SHED survey asks nationally representative sample questions on financial well-being, emergency savings, price changes, and housing costs. Jeff will present on findings both at the national level and the Mid-Atlantic. We will round out our presentation today with reflections on the meaning and implication of these findings from Dr. Valerie Wilson, who is Director of the Program on Race, Ethnicity, and the Economy at the Economic Policy Institute. Valerie will contextualize the data and discuss why reliable, accurate data is important, ensuring we understand not only numbers in the aggregate, but provide the context that disaggregated survey data can provide us. Before we start, though, I would like to take a moment to highlight the thread that will link each of these presentations, namely the relationship between macroeconomic indicators such as GDP or the unemployment rate to measure the health and growth of the United States economy, and the indicators we use to measure the health of an individual or a family's household economy. The macroeconomic numbers, percent GDP or percent unemployment, for example, tend to dominate the news cycles and policy debates. But what happens at the household level is of critical importance to understand. This is not to suggest that the two are not related, because they are. The level of output and growth of the economy are important determinants of what happens to individual people in America. There is a but. You cannot equate GDP, which is our national income, for example, with household incomes. To understand what is happening at the household level, we need to expand the indicators used in survey data that explores the lived experience of Americans to provide a rich context that takes geographical variation into consideration. Our presenters today will do just that and provide us with important insights into the health and well-being of individuals and families in the United States. With that, I turn it over to you, Rusty, to present on findings from the Empire State Poll.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you to Dr. Avgar for the opening comments. And thank you to all of you who are attending and on the line with us here today. I'm going to spend the first few minutes here building a little bit on what Dr. Anne-Marie Brady was just discussing, with some examples from pre-presidential election, looking at last year and the lead up to the election, how cost of living factored into that election in such a big way, but how the mainstream media, let's say, was communicating information about the economy back to individuals, and the disconnects that a lot of folks across the country might have been feeling with some of that communication. So to get started, there were a lot of headlines in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election that were effectively trying to downplay claims that cost of living was on the rise. So cost of living became one of, if not the most prominent issue in the 2024 election cycle, where the challenger, their campaign, and their allied media really hammered the presiding administration on rising prices. And the incumbent then felt that, of course, they need to get the narrative out there that there is a lot of good to be had in the economy, or there was a lot of good to be had in the economy at that point in time. So headlines like this one, where our economy isn't Goldilocks, it's better. This is some jargon that's often used in the economics journalistic by economic journalists to say that we often look for an economy that's the right mix of hot and cold, just like the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We want an economy that's not too hot in terms of job growth and in terms of wage growth, because that will put a lot of money into the economy and can drive up prices. And so we want to temper that so we don't see huge increases in cost of living or in inflation, which was, again, one of the metrics that was most closely tracked during the election cycle. There were media outlets that pushed back against that narrative, saying that, for example, when claims that inflation was under control in late 2023, early 2024 were coming out from some of the media, there were other publications that were challenging that and saying that that's only true if you look at core inflation, if you take food and volatile energy prices and things like this out of the mix, then inflation doesn't look so bad. But again, these aren't things that we can just omit from our daily lives. Energy, food, housing, for example, these are costs that we encounter each and every day, and so they need to be part of the narrative. And so while that undercurrent of pushback was out there, really what took shape was more of a conversation about, as Dr. Anne-Marie Brady was just saying, these aggregate economic indicators and how there were claims at the time that it really doesn't get much better. So again, we see major publications like the New York Times putting these claims out there. We see economists at Moody and other data repositories and economics analytics firms out there saying the same things, that we had high wage growth, we had job growth, we had inflation getting under control, maybe not necessarily hitting the Fed's target of 2%, but it looked like we had an economy at full employment, and gains were happening in all of the key indicators, including in household net worth, including in the stock market and stock indices. GDP and productivity growth was up. Aggregate labor force growth was on the rise. There was low overall unemployment, excuse me. Things were looking good. Things were looking relatively bright. However, as Dr. Brady was saying, we can't necessarily conflate indicators with the economy. When we start to say that the economy is, for example, the stock market, then we start to tell people, we start to tell the everyday voters or everyday residents of the country that what they're feeling or what they're seeing with their own eyes is incorrect, that stock markets are up, the indices are all pointing in the right direction, that you might not want to trust your feelings on this one. Look at the economic data and consider revising your views. And so rather than engaging, I'd say, meaningfully with a lot of the sentiments that were going out there, a lot of the mainstream rhetoric became, we need an educational campaign. Voters need to educate themselves. If you look at the actual numbers, the economy is in great shape, right? And it's very good advice, I should say, to encourage folks to go out there and dig into the data and to educate themselves on issues. It's very good advice. But when you tell folks that they shouldn't be believing what they're seeing or what they're encountering in the grocery store, that's going to build up some resentment, might not be the best word, but it's going to build up a little bit of aggravation among voters, and they're going to turn out and vote for whatever option that they think is going to get them out of the status quo, get them out of those, as the last headline said, angry feelings, or feelings that they were seeing their status of life or their quality of living start to decline. And so with all of that context in place, what happened after the election when the challenging candidate did win and the administration that presided over all of these growing economic indicators was being pushed out or transitioning out, a lot of those mainstream economists who were covering these issues went back and said that it was all vibes, right? We blame the voters for this. One of the most important issues in the election outcome was that many Americans believed that we had a bad economy even though we didn't. So the term vibe session was out there, that folks thought we were in a recession even though all of the economic data said, of course we're not, everything looks really good. Right? And that's not to say that everybody was piling on that same story. There were challenges out there, even in some mainstream publications, that said that there's a messaging problem here with a lot of folks who present on economic data, even with the campaign and administration that are trying to defend their economic record. It seems that for folks who are in those positions, inflation is unpleasant, but it's not a disaster, but it's a different reality for poor working class and lower middle class people. And so there was, again, this perception that the messaging strategy became condescension. It became lecturing rather than trying to engage or grapple with these issues. And so that's where, again, survey data come in, because while cost of living dominated the election cycle and became one of the key issues driving the election outcome, there were plenty of surveys out there, like you'll hear from my fellow panelists today, that showed economic pain and economic anxiety in the population. And one of the key principles of scientific work in general is that if you keep observing the same things over and over again, they're likely real, right? There's an empirical basis for it. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And so in our Empire State poll at the Cornell ILR school, which is for New York State, so the target universe is all adults in New York State, we worked with a survey research firm to create a representative sample of folks, about 2,700 folks in New York State, where each record then underwent professional weighting so that our sample population became representative of our target universe or target population. In our poll that was coincident with the election cycle, we collected data in the summer of 2024. We found that cost of living topped the list of issues that folks identified as the biggest issues facing facing New York State. This was the third year in a row that cost of living topped the charts. Often we see things like crime top a lot of these public opinion surveys, but cost of living has been running at the front of the pack on this issue for quite some time. Across New York State, almost 3 in 10 residents said that cost of living inflation is the #1 issue facing the state. That varied a bit by region throughout the state, but nowhere in no region was there an issue that's topped the list that was not related to cost of living or inflation. When we zoomed in and we asked folks about their specific household financial situation, so not what is a risk or a challenge to the New York State economy, but what is a challenge to you personally in your household? Again, cost of living and inflation topped the charts, followed by housing affordability. So across the state of New York, in every region, effectively, about 8 out of 10 people said that either everyday cost of living or housing, which again is a major component of cost of living, was the biggest issue facing their household. It's the biggest thing on their mind, the top thing that they were concerned about, and the top thing that's, again, given the timing, was probably factoring in and weighing in on their electoral decisions. Now, that's all well and good. It's easy enough to say that people were feeling the cost of living crunch, that people were certainly thinking about it during the election, but how did that shape their economic outlook and perhaps their political behavior, let's say? And so this is where we start to ask questions about how have you fared over the past year? How has the economy fared over the past year? And are you optimistic about the future? So again, if there is a quote unquote vibe session, we need to ask these types of questions to pick up on what the vibes are that are being felt by residents out there. And so when we asked adults in New York State whether the statewide economy has gotten better, stayed the same, or gotten worse over the past year, an overwhelming majority felt that the state's economy was in a worse position when we asked that question relative to a year prior. And that was the case no matter how we broke the data down by race, ethnicity, by gender, by region. This was a theme that emerged throughout, that there was a general pessimism about the state of the economy. And when we asked about whether or not that pessimism was going to continue on into the future, whether folks' outlooks were different, there's a bit more positivity in terms of thinking that the state's economy might get better within the next 12 months. About 19% of New Yorkers said they thought that the economy might get better, but the plurality are still saying they think things are getting worse, right? Things have gotten worse over the last year, and we're going to continue on this trend. So clearly, there's a lot of economic anxiety out there. When we zoomed in and asked about specifically your household financial situation, again, same sort of a deal. We asked, how have your household finances changed over the past year, and how do you expect them to change in the next year going forward? Again, what we saw is a lot of fear, a lot of panic and anxiety, where only 11% of respondents said that their household finances got better over the past year, where the plurality, again, nearly a majority, said that their household financial situation was worse relative to where it was a year before. This did have some variation across demographic groups. Again, the overall pattern is about the same for everyone. There's very little admission or belief that household finances got stronger over the year, but especially for individuals who identify as Hispanic or Latino, or identify with a racial or ethnic group that's not one of the major categories tracked by the Census Bureau, a majority of folks in those specific demographic subgroups said that things had gotten worse for them over the past year. Looking forward, there's again, sort of like the statewide or the aggregate economic question, there's a little bit more pessimism on this side, but still the plurality of individuals are expecting their household finances to continue to get worse. So we have this image or this picture taking shape where folks in New York State, at least, and we'll hear about some national data pretty soon to see how it compares, but at least folks in New York State felt that it was harder for them to survive. It was harder for them to live, that perhaps their wages had not grown at the same level as prices, and so their household financial situation was becoming tighter and tighter, and they felt that that was the case probably for the economy as a whole, that they weren't alone in that that's a statewide issue, if not a national issue. Now, if we pivot from that and pivot from the doom and gloom and the pessimism, there was a lot of optimism and a lot of support for strong working class priorities. We message tested things like a higher minimum wage, We asked folks whether or not the state's minimum wage should be pegged to a living wage calculator like the MIT calculator, which for New York would mean a minimum wage of maybe up to about $26 per hour. And more than 6 out of every 10 respondents said that, yes, that's a good idea. We support that. We have a link to the report in the chat. You can go see we had a representative sample based on partisan identity and ideology, as well as gender, race, ethnicity, and age across New York State. So this isn't something where just folks from one side of the aisle are supporting these initiatives. There was broad-based support for a higher minimum wage. There was broad-based support for labor unions in general. 2/3 of our respondents approve of labor unions. There's decades of empirical research out there that shows labor unions are pretty good at boosting wages and getting more benefits for workers. So again, working class priorities. We message tested. There had been some discussion at the time of introducing legislation to the New York State Legislature on a 4-day work week. We made sure that folks knew that that would apply to everybody, right, for all workers in the economy. And about 2/3 of respondents, again, from all regions across the state, either agreed or strongly agreed that they would support that sort of a measure for New York State's economy. From our last Empire State poll, too, we also asked a question. We had a battery of questions about care work and childcare in particular. And we asked individuals if they thought that childcare should be a universal public service like K through 12 education. And here we had almost 8 out of 10 residents say yes. And so when we get to what does this all mean, what are the key takeaways? Well, we have a picture of aggregate macroeconomic indicators that are showing a very strong economy. But workers aren't necessarily enjoying life in that economy based on some of the survey results. And so if we over rely on just these aggregate indicators, at least 2 fallacies are going to make their way into our thinking. One is called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This was something coined by Alfred North Whitehead. It's basically mistaking the indicators for the economy. And so if we see the economy and we think it's just GDP and the stock market, net worth, unemployment, then we build an economy to make those indices go in the directions that we want them to go. And we take away the human elements of the economy. And then the other fallacy, this goes kind of hand in hand, is called the ecological fallacy. This is where we're assuming what's true of the aggregate indicators is therefore going to be true for all of the people whose data was contributed to the aggregate indicators, who responded to a survey or whose W-2 or payroll information went into the creation of one of those indicators. And that's certainly not true, as the story that we're trying to tell here today is showing. What we're finding is that workers are struggling to keep up with rising costs. They're pessimistic about the state of the economy and their own household finances. And what they do support, though, what they are more optimistic about, are progressive working class policy proposals to raise wages, lower costs, and to provide more generous benefits and social services. And so it seems like a self-evident point to be made, but as we move forward from this and reflect back on the last presidential election and some of the messaging around it and what strategies go into explaining how the economy works and how we can connect that message with actual working class residents and voters, we need to engage with their policy priorities and feelings. When we just take this strategy of trying to correct their incorrect beliefs or tell them that what they're experiencing isn't real and that our indicators instead are what's real and they need to get on board with that, that's going to create a lot of frustration. That's going to create probably some resentment. It's going to create political discord. And so that's the environment that we're sort of operating in right now, is figuring out exactly what does it take to explain how an economy is functioning and whether it's working for everyone. So I will stop there and pass it back to Anne-Marie for our next panelist.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful, Rusty. So much to discuss as we move on. And speaking of discussion, I forgot to remind everyone on the webinar today, please put your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom, because we will have time at the end of the presentations to discuss and respond to your questions. So now in the interim, I turn it over to Therese Daly to present on ALICE findings.
Thank you so much, Anne Marie, and great job, Rusty. And thank you, Dr. Avgar, for the introduction. I am so thrilled and honored to be here and to present with all of you. Thank you all for taking time out of your day. I know how busy everyone is and the pressures of everyday work, so I really appreciate you being here. I am going to talk about understanding economic anxiety and the ALICE population. This information, as Anne Marie so kindly mentioned in the introduction, is our 2025 update on the financial hardship based on the 2025 ALICE report. So, who is ALICE? The ALICE population is statewide. No matter how hard these individuals work, financial stability grows farther out of reach with each passing day. Hidden in plain sight, these are struggling households that are asset limited, income constrained, and employed. The ALICE households bring in income above the federal poverty level, but less than the cost of basics in the counties which they live. So while ALICE households have been struggling in the shadows for far too long, the irony is that we all know ALICE households. In fact, we're already talking about them, and we are even on this webinar. Many of the terms we've used when talking about these households is such as the working poor, the invisible, and the forgotten. That's often used to describe the ALICE households. At United for ALICE, which is a national research organization from New Jersey, whose work is backed by over 300 experts nationwide, has dubbed this the name ALICE and given us a way to quantify this population and look out for them. So, who is ALICE? ALICE can be a neighbor, a friend, a family member, a colleague, or even ourselves. ALICE workers typically include childcare providers, retail salespeople, cashiers, waiters, delivery service drivers, gas station attendants, first responders, and caregivers. Think for a moment about the ALICE workers that you've encountered, probably just today. Maybe you dropped your children off at a childcare center this morning, or you filled your gas at the gas station before your workday, or maybe you went to your favorite coffee or deli for breakfast or lunch. Or you may have run an errand at a grocery store. There may even be a package outside of your door right now that was delivered by a member of the ALICE household. ALICE individuals and households face impossible choices. Often the families are forced to make decisions between paying a heating bill, buying good quality food for the family, paying for childcare, or sometimes having to reduce the hours of work just to be able to afford someone to take care of their child. So, unfortunately, households also sometimes often, especially with the cuts coming down from the federal government, will often potentially have to choose between any of those choices and healthcare basic needs. We've found that each day the ALICE households and individuals have to make impossible decisions just in order to survive. So I've been using some terms. The ALICE terms is, as I said, asset limited, income constrained, employed. They are households, to clarify, that are above the federal poverty level, also known as FPL, but less than the basic cost of living in their county. The ALICE household survival budget is the minimum cost of household necessities, such as housing, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, and technology, plus taxes adjusted for all U.S. counties and various household compositions. And then the ALICE threshold is derived from the household survival budget. That's the minimum average income that a household needs to afford basic costs calculated for all U.S. counties. And then below the ALICE threshold includes households in poverty and ALICE households combined. So, to understand the true extent of hardship in New York, these staggering statistics should give you, unfortunately, the very hard reality that New Yorkers are struggling. 14% of the households are in poverty in New York State. 33% are ALICE households. That brings 47% of the total households in New York are unable to collectively afford basic needs in New York State. Key findings. So between the Alice households and the households living in poverty, an estimated 40%, as I mentioned, of the households in New York were below the Alice threshold in 2023. This rate places New York 49th among all of the states in the US and the District of Columbia, which is the first representing the lowest rate of hardship. Between 2010 and 2023, the number of households in New York increased by 8%, the number of households in poverty increased by 10%, and the number of Alice households increased by 21%. Though the majority of adults in New York were working in 2023, and most households have at least one worker, only 21% of the population that is age 16 and over had the security of a full-time job with a salary. And if you take anything from my section, I would ask that you take that example. Then with the aging baby boomer generation, households headed by individuals 65 and up were the fastest growing age group in New York. That is up 40% from 2010 to 2023. And they were also the age group with the most substantial increase in the number of households below the Alice threshold, meaning they are the ones that are most likely going to struggle. And I just want to also say that the aging population is a big focus of United Way of New York State, because we really understand that that population will go without food if it means paying their utility bill, paying their mortgage, paying their rent. So when paychecks don't add up, and I just wanted to included this graph because I would really like you to be able to see, to understand that on average, the basic costs exceed the wages of the most common jobs. So you may have a first responder or a common job in New York State, and you are not paid enough to afford the average basic need. And that is a problem. We all need to do our best and effort to support individuals that are in the workforce, support the businesses that employ them, and support the statistics and the understanding and spreading awareness about the importance of providing a good quality life and pathways for allowing New Yorkers to get there. Action steps. So we must work together as a society to provide everyone with a good quality of life, and that involves access to skills that are in demand, upskilling, and good paying jobs. In order to decrease these numbers, we must work with businesses in our communities and statewide on educating and the importance of having salaries that allow for a good quality of life. And lastly, utilizing the services within each other. If you have a coworker, a colleague, or someone you know in your area, we ask that you please do your duty in sharing resources. You're welcome to please share information about United Way and 211. 211 is our emergency resource that will help you with utilities, clothing, housing, technology help, and we are available 24/7. 365 days a week in 180 different languages.
Great. That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Therese. We'll turn it now over to Jeff, who will present on shed data at the national and mid-Atlantic level.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Thank you very much for including me in this session today. So I'm excited to be able to be here and talk about this survey of household economics and decision-making, also known as the SHED. I want to acknowledge the many other people who contribute to the SHED report on this slide, and also note the disclaimer at the bottom that everything I say represents my own views and should not be attributed to the Federal Reserve. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the SHED, I just wanted to start by giving a brief overview of what the survey is. This is a nationally representative survey fielded annually by the Federal Reserve of US adults ages 18 and older. The survey started back in 2013. Coming out of the Great Recession, we were really interested in understanding more about the financial circumstances, financial opportunities, financial challenges of US households, and how that fits with the broader macroeconomic statistics. And really here having a specific focus on how low and moderate income families are doing. In the most recent survey, we surveyed over 12,000 respondents nationwide in October 2024. I'm going to share some of the results with you today, both at the national level and for the Mid-Atlantic. But there's also a full report on the survey, as well as all of the individual level microdata, if you're going to dig deeper into it, available on the Federal Reserve's website. So whenever I'm thinking about the SHED data and what it's saying about how families are doing across the country, I really like to start with these two measures. One of them is a more subjective measure and the other is a more objective measure. So on the left-hand side is the share of adults who say that they are either doing okay or living comfortably. So respondents have 4 answer choices ranging from finding it difficult to get by to living comfortably. And this is the share who chose the top 2 of those 4 answers. And what you can see is that in 2024, the share who are saying they're at least doing okay was relatively similar to the previous 2 years. 73% of adults said they were either doing okay or living comfortably financially. But this is down from where it was in 2021, which was a year when we had more financial supports coming out of the COVID pandemic. We also didn't have the prolonged period of inflation as well at that point in time. So I think the combination of the supports and inflation was really affecting families and brought that down some. I always do like to also emphasize, though, the longer term pattern here, going back to where we started the survey. Even though we are down from where we were in 2021, we do see that the share of people who are saying they're doing at least okay financially is up about 10 percentage points from when we started the survey. So I think there has been some progress, although we also have seen some backsliding in the last couple of years as families are dealing with higher prices. On the right-hand side is another measure of people's finances, a more objective measure, where we ask people how they would cover a relatively small $400 financial emergency that they had to pay. So thinking here about a car repair, an appliance repair that they have to deal with. This is a very different measure of how households and families are doing, but you see the time trend is looking pretty similar, that the last 2 years have been relatively stable. 2024 looks similar to what it did the previous 2 years, but still down from where it was in 2021, but up from when we started the survey back in 2013. I can then zoom in to look at the Mid-Atlantic region specifically. And I think there's kind of 2 major takeaways here. The first is that the Mid-Atlantic, by and large, did have slightly higher financial well-being across both of these measures relative to adults nationwide. So 76% of people in the Mid-Atlantic, for example, said they were doing at least okay financially, 3 percentage points above the national average. But at the same time, you also can see that in 2024, in the Mid-Atlantic region, there has been some loss of this advantage relative to the nation as a whole for both of these. So while nationally, the share of adults who said that they're at least doing okay financially or would cover a $400 expense using cash or its equivalent, and I probably should specify as I was talking about that one, I apologize, the cash or its equivalent there is meaning that they would use cash or credit card they pay off at the end of the month. So we think of that as kind of, they're using it similar to cash as opposed to having to borrow or simply not being able to pay the expense. But so both these measures in 2024, we see that the share of adults in the Mid-Atlantic who appear to be doing relatively well financially declined while it was relatively steady for the national picture. So underlying all of these kind of broad measures of how households are doing, how they're feeling about their own finances, whether they have the ability to cover small financial emergencies, are a broad range of financial situations, financial challenges. And so we have a completely open-ended question on our survey where we just ask people, what's the biggest financial challenge that you have in your life? And they can type in anything that they want. We then have used a consistent coding scheme back to 2016 to then take this and categorize their answers. And so what you can see is that back in 2016, about half of people told us they had no financial challenges they wanted to share with us. And those who did report financial challenges to us, it was relatively evenly split across these 5 categories. In the last 3 years, including 2024, it's a completely different picture. The share who are talking about inflation and prices is by by far the most prominent type of answer that we're getting. And in 2024, even though the headline inflation rates came down, the share of people who are talking about inflation and prices as their main challenge remained high. I do want to note that kind of underlying this, there's two pieces going on. I've been intentionally using the word inflation and prices, not just inflation, because in 2024, a lot more people are talking about high prices as opposed to rising prices. But I think this still emphasizes the fact that prices are very much front of mind, at the forefront of how households feel like they're doing and faring financially, and the types of issues that they're having to struggle with. So what are some of those financial challenges that they're dealing with, and high prices? One of those certainly is rents and housing costs. So this is the median rent for the individual and their spouse through each of the regions across the country. Nationally, the median rent was $1,200. And you can see that the Mid-Atlantic has two particular issues of note here. One is that their median rent is higher than the national average, so $1,290 compared to $1,200. And the second is that the median rent has also been increasing. So New England and the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions have median rents that are going up faster than the rest of the country. The second big area of people's budgets that I want to touch on in terms of costs is childcare costs. We have a lot in the survey that talks about people's childcare expense and childcare needs. Here I need to look at the Mid-Atlantic and New England as a collective because of the smaller sample size and just focusing on parents. I really like to ground childcare costs in housing costs, which are normally people's most expensive costs in their house. And so for the New England and Mid-Atlantic region, median rents and mortgages was $1,800 among parents. But when you look at the median childcare costs for those who have childcare, it's over 3/4 of what they're spending on housing, about $1,400. And if you look at people who are intensive users of childcare, they're actually spending more on childcare than they are on housing payments. So I think this really speaks to why childcare costs in particular are such an acute issue for many parents. So what is it that people then do when they're struggling with these high costs and high cost of living? So one option is to just do without. We've asked on the survey for a number of years whether people skipped any prescription drugs, medical care, dental care, because they couldn't afford in the past year. And over 1/4 of adults nationwide, 23% of the Mid-Atlantic region, said that they skipped prescription drugs, medical care, or dental care in the year before the survey. And I also want to draw your attention to that period from 2021 to 2022, where we see increases in both the Mid-Atlantic and across the United States, consistent with the fact that people are struggling with the higher costs. And one of the ways that they coped with that was by then skipping some medical treatments. The last thing that I want to touch on is going back to housing, which is homeowners insurance. And this is another way that we think that people can be dealing with higher costs of saying, what are the expenses that I don't have to, that's not giving me benefit today that I don't have to be thinking about? And if among people who say, I'm struggling to afford groceries, they might say, well, my homeowners insurance, that's not really doing anything right now, and I'm going to just take the risk that I'm not going to need it. So 7% of homeowners nationwide said they went without homeowners insurance. This is an area where the Mid-Atlantic does relatively well compared to the nation as a whole. But you can particularly then look down at some of the southern regions in the west, south, central region, including Texas, where 13% of homeowners said that they are going without homeowners insurance. And so I think that these last two slides kind of indicate some of the ways that families are coping with these challenges by either saying, I'm going to just go without something such as medical care, or I'm going to forgo, sort of put this risk to the side and hope that it doesn't happen. But of course, that then puts them at risk that if a disaster does occur, they're not going to have that insurance backstop and can spiral on them and create a larger hardship down the road.
And now we will turn it over to Valerie Wilson, who will provide some context to all these numbers.
Right. Thank you, Anne Marie. And as you've already stated, it's my job to kind of wrap all this up and bring it all together. So hopefully I can do that in the 10 minutes. Thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today. And I really want to begin my presentation by acknowledging the fact that, There's been a lot in the news lately that would serve to erode public trust in our national statistics and the institutions that produce them by suggesting that they are somehow unreliable or rigged or politically motivated. This conversation is not that. I think that U.S. statistical agencies are among the most reputable in the world, that they're known for methodological rigor, independence, and transparency. The data they publish are the product of careful work by hundreds of expert economists, statisticians, and other civil servants who follow very transparent and well-established methodologies. That being the case, this conversation is less about the reliability and integrity of our national statistics and really more about the messages communicated from that data. While a lot of public messaging about the economy focuses on maybe one or two metrics, we all know that no single economic indicator can tell the full story of everyone's experiences with the economy. Macroeconomic indicators are important for evaluating the general health and direction of the economy and are used by the Federal Reserve for setting interest rates. State and local policymakers use them to set budgets. Business leaders use the data to decide and make hiring decisions. But that's one side of things. I think a broader set of disaggregated economic measures coming from a lot of those same sources, as well as the survey data like those presented by Rusty, Therese, and Jeff, can and should be used to tell a more complete story. With any of these sources, however, context matters a lot in terms of getting an accurate interpretation of that data, as well as establishing clear messaging. And with that in mind, I think at least 4 questions should be considered when we're looking at the data. 1, what are we measuring? 2, when is it being measured? 3, where geographically is it being measured? And for whom is it being measured? There's a lot of variation across all of these dimensions that come into play. And so in my presentation today, I want to share a few examples, primarily from EPI research, of how answering those questions can help bridge the gap between how people feel about the economy and their well-being and what the macroeconomic data are showing us. I'm going to focus also primarily on wages and unemployment, which are the outcomes I use most in my work, but I think it goes without saying that those labor market experiences influence a lot of other economic concerns like the affordability of housing, childcare, access to healthcare, a lot of the other things that you've already heard today. So the first example concerns wages and wage growth, and this deals with that question of what is being measured. This chart is taken from a piece that we published earlier this year, and the big news story in that was that there was actually faster wage growth for Black and Hispanic workers relative to white workers between 2019 and 2024. I'll also note that all of the wage data I'm going to reference are based on inflation-adjusted median wages. So this has already been adjusted for rising prices. What we're measuring here in this chart, however, is wage growth and not wage levels. Persistent racial gaps have been a consistent feature of the U.S. labor market for decades. So while this faster wage growth in recent years is a fact, it has narrowed those gaps somewhat, it did not eliminate those gaps. And so workers' awareness of these kinds of inequities can contribute to how they feel about the economy and how they interpret their circumstances relative to others. The next point I want to make, and I'll transition over to the next slide in a second, is about the darker blue bars. We can see across all groups of workers here, the last 5 years wage growth was clearly faster than the preceding 40 years. So that brings us to the question of when are we measuring? This slide, I also want to capture a point about messaging and clear and accurate messaging. 2 of my colleagues recently published a piece that these charts come from basically updating EPI's characterization of long-term wage trends, identifying it as a trend of wage suppression rather than the much stricter characterization we used before of wage stagnation. That was done in light of the fact that there's clearly stronger wage growth over the last 5 years, so it's hard to look at this chart and call it stagnant. So came to the conclusion that suppression was a more accurate messaging and description of this trend. Some of the considerations that went into that messaging were: one, median real wages, as shown in that chart, have been flat for most of that post-1979 period, except for the last 10 years and a brief few years in the late 1990s. In those periods where we do see consistently strong wage growth, those were periods of tight labor markets, which have actually been relatively rare in most of that 40-year period. Again, the late 1990s and those last 5 years are times that we have seen unemployment at or below 4%. That has not been the norm for most of that time period. The other consideration here is that 29% cumulative growth in median real wages isn't nothing, but it is far slower than the economy's potential to deliver wage growth as measured by productivity growth, which was about 83% over that same period of time. So this chart captures, the theme, the trend that we know of as growing wage inequality. And again, people's awareness of inequality and the unfairness associated with that also feeds into some negative feelings or concerns about the economy and your specific position in it if you're not one of the wealthier members of this society. Taking that another step, we can also break out the wage distribution to look at the lowest wage earners and even compare it to the median. So when we consider average annual wage growth during those tight labor market years versus all other post-1979 years, we see even faster wage growth for those in the lower end of the distribution compared to those at the median. Whereas most of that post-1979 period, wages were flat for those in the median. At the median, the lowest wage earners actually lost ground or saw a decline. So despite the relatively faster growth among the lowest earners, at least in recent years, it's important to note, going back to the point I made before when we looked at the racial comparison in wage growth, that the level of wages is still insufficient, even though we've seen the faster growth. So that 10th percentile worker, even if they worked full time, which is questionable because at that wage level, you're more likely to be paid hourly and would have limited control over your work hours. But if you were to be able to get a full-time work schedule, annual pay would be less than $30,000 a year. So again, yeah, faster wage growth, but still insufficient wages. The next point or example I want to draw out here, it gets to that question of where are we measuring things and how different the story can look based on geography. So another major finding that we wrote a lot about in the last couple of years was that in 2023, the national Black unemployment rate was at a record low. The official estimate based on BLS data was 5.5%, but this particular chart is based on data from the American Community Survey, which provides a larger sample size needed for us to look at more granular estimates at the local area. So the 7.2% in this graph is different from the official 5.5% because there are different surveys with different reference periods. But for the point of comparison, it still draws out just how different that rate can look across the country. So even in a year where we're touting and citing a record low Black unemployment rate, when we look at the 10 metro areas with the largest Black populations, 5 were below that national average. Metro DC, Miami, Atlanta, Dallas, and Philadelphia were all below the average, while there were a couple who were well above that average. In particular, Metro Chicago and Detroit were much higher. You'll see the New York metro area, pretty consistent with the national, but still just a bit higher than that national rate. The other thing I think it's important to draw out here, and just how much place can make a difference in someone's economic experience, is that even within the metro area, if we look at the central city in each of those areas, in nearly all cases, the central city unemployment rate was much higher than the broader metropolitan statistical area or the state. So again, we have differences based on race, ethnicity, gender, but also geographically, we can find significant differences in geographic areas that aren't even that far apart. We can see major differences in people's experiences. So finally, this last example kind of goes back to that question of what is being measured. At EPI, we produce a quarterly measure of state unemployment rates by race and ethnicity. And at one point in the last year, we noticed that 2 states, Alabama.
Valerie, you're frozen. Tell you what, I think what we'll do is, yes, we'll move on to questions, and then when we get Valerie back on, we'll have her finish up. We'll have her finish up her last couple slides because they're very important. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for these fantastic presentations. We have several questions from the audience, and I, though, would like to start us off with a question that is kind of on my mind, and of course, I'm looking for my question now. Central to this conversation is, and Valerie talked about this very explicitly, but is really the importance of federal data and the role of federal data, but also data gathered at the state or local level, data in general. And I think what I'm wondering, as many perhaps are wondering, is that what do we need to do to strengthen and improve our data collection in general? And what are some of the hurdles or challenges in this particular political climate that we find ourselves in?
I can jump in first with some thoughts on that. So I want to echo what a lot of my fellow panelists said, that we tend to do data collection pretty well in the US. Our federal agencies, our state agencies have very great metadata that shows exactly how to use and work with data sets. There's consistency over time. So they allow us, in some cases, near real-time tracking of key economic indicators. But I think that is a bit separate from the idea that, again, what we monitor isn't necessarily what the economy is. And so if we're just investing in collecting data that is looking at increases in productivity or unemployment or job and wage growth, that's where we have some of our most robust and greatest time series data that we can look at and explore for whether things are moving in the right direction or not. We don't have similar metrics necessarily that give us real-time information on how a typical household is faring, or like to Teresa's presentation on how individuals who are employed full-time and working and still not able to cover their bills, what are the gaps? Because that's really where we can see and inform public policy and start to fill in those gaps. I had mentioned, we had asked in our poll on childcare resources specifically, because that was coming up as one of the biggest hurdles. And I think Jeff's presentation really hit that home. In New York, a lot of families tend to pay more for childcare than they do for housing. And so there are a lot of support. There is a lot of support out there in society for transforming our systems of social services and care and work and employment. But when we're too focused on one set of data indicators or another, we might be building in different directions that are starting to disconnect and divorce from what everyday workers' priorities are. So I think, to your point, Anne-Marie, rather than pooling funds out of the agencies that collect all of our best data, I think that's a target for more funding and for additional support and that's what a lot, so much of our policymaking is rooted in those figures and those statistics that if we defund that at all, then we'll probably start making policies and telling stories that aren't necessarily representative of our people. And I think that's what a lot of us were trying to say in one way or another today. So yeah, that's all I've got there. Just reinvesting in the methodologies that are used are really sound. They're verified, they're established, they're peer reviewed. And so allowing us to do more of that more often and in more topical areas is going to give us better information.
Therese, thank you, Rusty.
Thank you, Rusty. And Jeff, I was just going to say, I completely agree, Rusty. I would say I'm so proud of the United for Alice team in New Jersey that helps create this data. They use U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey as the primary source, but then they also use local level data. So they work with the counties, they work with the states, they work with the municipalities, the subdivisions, and the zip codes while taking all of that data, while additionally using HUD data, USDA data, and really incorporating it to be a full-fledged report so that it's well-rounded and that there is, not as much as of a fear of one specific area dominating the data or fear of overpowerment and not having a checks and balances. And then to Rusty's beautiful, eloquent point, we use that data at United Way of New York State and 211 New York to help us write and draft our legislative priorities. And we do that, and we also work with the elected officials, some of whom are on this call. Thank you, by the way, for your support. In framing the legislation that the state and the federal government needs to work on based off of this data, because it is quite checks and balance and from multiple different sources.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that sort of Valerie mentioned in her talk was she was using the ACS versus the CPS. And I think that we have all these different data sources and they all are giving us different things. And I think that that's as we're thinking about how to strengthen our data infrastructure, it's useful to think about how, what is it that each of the different data sources are giving us? And they all are serving a unique purpose. I do other work using IRS data, for example, and that data is great for understanding people's incomes. But it also is it's created not for research purposes. It's created to administer the tax system. And so therefore it can change with the tax system. And that then creates time series breaks. I think that's where things like that are really helpful for understanding why we need surveys, because surveys are intended to be consistent, measuring things over time. And then also having different surveys covering different areas. The SHED is very different than the CPS, very different from the ACS. Very different from the Empire State Poll. And I think that all of these pieces work together, and we're not going to just be able to completely replace I wouldn't want the SHED to be replacing the CPS. I wouldn't want the CPS to replace the SHED, because we're doing different things, and it's important to fill all those different gaps kind of through this decentralized system, because otherwise you are going to just be missing aspects of the economy.
So a theme that's, you raised it, Therese, just recently, but kind of a leitmotif throughout these various presentations is really what can we learn from the data? So one person sent in a question, and their question is, what is one insight from your data that you feel policymakers or the public most often overlook when discussing economic well-being?
I would say, in my opinion, people don't focus on the fact that almost half of the households are struggling, period. People focus on more topical. We see these bills that are helping utility managers prevent from rate hikes. We see housing having good cause legislation. We see the relatively profound efforts on individual topics, but not the actual focus that New Yorkers and the households are struggling, and that almost half of the population is at all times stressed about one of those basic necessities. I would say that would be the biggest thing. I hope that answers, but I would say that would be the biggest thing.
One thing that often gets overlooked that comes out of our data, and there's also FDIC also has some great data on this, are the share of people who aren't connected to the banking system. And as we it's very easy to think about like, oh, everyone has the same financial connectedness that I do. But that's not the case. Most people have a US bank account, but 6% of adults don't. And as we're thinking about like how money is getting to people, that's really important when you're thinking about, and then like zooming in further, among people who make under $25,000 a year, over 20% of people don't have a bank account. And if we just assume, oh, everyone has the same resources that we do in terms, like, so I can direct deposit it into people's accounts, that's not the case. And so where these sorts of surveys can be really helpful is understanding the specific challenges that people have and like that, because we need to be thinking about those as we're figuring out our various public policies.
Yeah, I'm kind of going to steal Trace's answer a little bit. I'd say one of the biggest overlooked things that come out of some of the Empire State polling work that we've done at the ILR school for a couple of years is just how similar we all are, right? These concerns are held by supermajorities, mostly of New Yorkers from every region of the state. It's not upstate versus downstate, rural versus urban. Everybody's affected by a lot of these issues, and that leads to a lot of popular support for specific ideas about how to transform the economy. And so we don't want to miss those messages if there are strategies or opportunities or programs or interventions that sort of ignore the political and ideological spectrum and affect everybody equally. And so that's what, again, survey data are supplementary to all of our state, federal, and local data collection programs, but using them together in that way, it points to different strategies, doing things differently rather than trying to reinforce the same systems and same ideas that have got us into this point.
Great, thank you. Well, welcome back, Valerie. Glad to see you. We've just been having a discussion about a few questions, but I'd really love to turn it back to you so you could finish, pick up where you left off, and so you could finish your presentation. Then we'll rotate you into the conversation and to the discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry for the interruption. You know, these unpredictable things can happen. So I'm actually on my phone now. We shouldn't get interrupted. Okay, so I was closing out the presentation and I'm not able to do it on the phone, but the point I was making with that last slide, showing unemployment rates, state level unemployment rates for Alabama and Maryland looked very similar in those years, and both were lower than the national for the Black unemployment rate. But the unemployment rate is a measure that tells us the difficulty in finding employment among those in the labor force. So that's among the employed or those actively looking for work, but it ignores people not actively looking for work. When we used a different measure, which was the employment population ratio, which actually just tells us what percentage of the population has a job, much bigger differences emerged. We saw that there was a much larger share of the Black population employed in Maryland than in Alabama. We dug a little deeper to look at some of the other features of those labor markets and found that some of the factors likely contributing to those differences that didn't show up in unemployment rates and would also likely affect how people felt about the economy and their own well-being included the fact that Alabama has a much higher incarceration rate than Maryland. That impacts people's ability to get and maintain employment. Alabama does not have a minimum wage, whereas Maryland has a $15 minimum wage. Again, the returns to putting in the time and effort to finding a job, especially if you're a lower wage worker, are significantly different in those two places. And also we found that Alabama lacked a lot of the pro-worker family supportive policies like Maryland's paid sick days and paid family and medical leave laws that are of Maryland. So in conclusion, I think the big message sort of tying all of this together is that simple messages are much easier to convey, but they leave out a lot of the details and a lot of the details that really matter to individuals. Our ability to sort of disaggregate and dig deeper and to look more closely at how things vary by geography
is very much tied to our ability as a country to maintain a robust, transparent, and methodologically rigorous national statistical infrastructure so that we can get to the depth and breadth and the kind of information needed to understand more of the nuances behind those big picture numbers. So I'll stop there and we can continue with questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie. All right. So many people have submitted questions about what do we need from a policy perspective. It's an interesting question, really, in light of where we are today, particularly in light of the passage of the recent big, beautiful bill. So we have kind of a policy piece on the one hand. On the other hand, we also have a country, and if anyone has ever listened to me on webinars or my students in class, whichever, you're going to find that I like to kind of say in America, we have like 50 principalities, and then we have like a gazillion mini principalities within the big principalities, right? So, it's every, states are doing different things. You just mentioned, Valerie, we've got a $15 minimum wage in Maryland. We have Alabama that relies on the $7.25 federal minimum wage, right? So vast disparities within the country. And we have, so when we think about a policy response, I mean, it's not a policy response, but we're thinking about what is the appropriate set of policies to address these concerns. What do we need? What do we do? How do we convey the enormity of these problems? And how can we use policy as the appropriate tool to address this?
So I think many of the things that we've already been referencing today are important. I think raising the federal minimum wage is critical because we know that there are those states that without a federal increase, they will never see an increase locally. So that's important. I think another thing that we have spoken a bit about today is the importance of unions and people having the right to organize and collectively bargain and how important that is. For making sure that people have family sustaining wages, they have the kinds of benefits that they need. I think another important role that unions play, and that I often talk about, is that it can be a proactive anti-discrimination measure because bargaining agreements are often very detailed in terms of specifying pay levels and requirements and what's needed to go to the next step so that you have that transparency involved in employment and pay. I think, a number of other things. Overtime thresholds are another factor I think that affects a lot of working families. The issue of misclassification. Workers are being misclassified as independent contractors rather than employees is something that is gaining traction, I think, more on the state level than our national policy. So there are a multitude of things that we know are important to strengthening working families and to improving families' economic security that can be done from a policy perspective as it relates to work, but also I think a lot of the family supporting policies that unfortunately have been cut back by the reconciliation bill are also things that are necessary for people's economic well-being.
I would just say really quick to go off of those beautiful points. At the state level, it'd be great to have more of a look at the fiscal cliff and benefits cliff. There's a task force bill that is awaiting Governor Hochul's veto or signage that I think would start to look at some of the discrepancies. We have to identify the barriers from individuals coming out of the cycle of poverty, coming out of that FPL and coming out of the Alice households. So how best can we help them? And by utilizing and encouraging an advancement and skills that are in demand and allow them to have kind of pathways to a better quality job and a better quality of life, then I think that would holistically be able to help. There is right now, if you are at a 200% poverty cap, you can have your your public benefits be disregarded under an income disregard for 6 months while you pursue a state-approved program. I really think that should be increased to 400%, and there is language in New York State to do that as well. Different things I think we can attack, again, going at a look at it more holistically. And then last but not least, I think we need to engage with our business community. We were fortunate at United Way of New York State to have the Business Council of New York State under President Heather Brissetti's leadership sponsor this year's Alice report. And that's a great example of integration of a sector that we need to have an understanding about this to be able to work together on a better quality of life.
This is like, it's an area where a lot of different people can play a role in helping to like address these challenges that families have. And so I'll kind of use an example from our survey that I think is kind of helpful and informative. I shared the small emergency expense, how many families struggle to pay small financial emergencies as they arrive. And back when we started this survey, there wasn't a whole lot of a focus on that from a kind of policy standpoint. But given the magnitude of these challenges over the past decade, we've heard about more employers, more banks starting to say, how can we be thinking about that challenge? And for an employer, it really matters that you say, like, they can look at this and say, if I have an employee whose car breaks down and they're not able to afford to get it fixed and they can't get to work anymore, like that's a problem from their perspective. And if they're able to have short-term loans or able to help this for some of their employees, then it has been able to solve this for some workers. So I think that this is kind of a area where lots of different entities can play a role. And as a data provider with our survey, I think of one of our roles is to help understand where those issues are, that then lets the policymakers, the employers, the banks, et cetera, think about how they can come up with various solutions to address them.
I'll just jump in and add, speaking for myself and certainly not the rest of the panel or any organization that I have an affiliation with. There was at least the start of a playbook, I think, right after the COVID pandemic. We saw a vast increase in the amount of social support being flooded into the economy with expanded unemployment insurance benefits. We did research in my unit that saw that was correlated with some increases in entrepreneurialism and self-employment and workers being able to get out and look for a career change or go into a path that was more of a passion for them and not just a job. So they were finding more long-term careers. The expanded child tax credits that was, if you were registered with the IRS and had your checking account information in there for your tax returns, that was just direct deposited into folks' accounts every month, that a lot of headline reporting said cut child poverty in half, was allowed to expire. These were support systems that had clear, tangible benefits, and they gave us somewhat of a game plan. And just seeing how the biggest struggles that we continuously hear about are with housing, with childcare, with things and food, with things that people need. Just having those things as commodified in the economy as they are really gets to one of the roots of these issues, and thinking about ways of, whether it's through universal basic income or some other program to decommodify housing. These are the areas that are keeping people back. They're holding folks back from chasing those opportunities that, say, an expanded unemployment insurance program might have given them at one point in time in the pandemic era here. So those are types of things that are coming out of these surveys. To me, people's biggest struggles are with what they need to live. They have to pay a certain cost just to be able to survive. And that crowds out any opportunities for them to proceed in any direction that's going to allow them to actually thrive.
Such an interesting point all of you have made, and it makes me think about, in many ways, what prevents us from what takes us a long time. Let's just say what takes us a long time to move forward on some of these policies is a perception in America that is very old, that if you are low income or if you are poor, you are undeserving, right? You haven't worked hard enough to get these, you haven't earned, so to speak, benefits and services that are appropriate to everyone, to provide opportunities. What I'm hearing is that, obviously, I think as researchers, we know that this isn't true, but it's a perception that's out there in the media. And maybe we need to think about ways in which we counter that media with the fact is, look, if people don't, people are working very hard. People are working very hard and still cannot provide for their families and themselves the way they need to and want to, that we're actually holding ourselves back economically as a country, right? Opportunity for individuals is opportunity for America. I wonder if you can speak to that in how we package the findings from your research in a way that gets beyond these kind of entrenched perceptions that, in a way, in my opinion, I've always kind of thought prohibit us from maximizing the full potential of the American America that we know and we have.
I totally agree with you. And I think one of the challenges that we have is that the negative perception is so strong and so pervasive, that I don't know that it really becomes difficult to build the political will to do these things, because when we see surveys, we see that people are very much in support of those things that need to get done. I think that those political challenges tend to be things that are a bit stickier among elected officials in getting those things done. But I do think, in terms of packaging findings and data results, that it's important to show how those kinds of things are a benefit to all of us as a society and as an economy. One of the things that we've written about in looking at some of the cuts now they will be cuts to Medicaid, the impact that has for future generations and people who will be in the labor market in the future, how much that access to quality healthcare is important for a child's development, so that when they grow into an adult, they're in a much better place to enter the labor market and to have the ability to earn good wages and contribute economically to the economy. So I think it helps a lot when we can get beyond those narratives that sort of segregate and isolate people, and these people are deserving, these people are undeserving, and showing how those kinds of investments benefit our economy, our society more broadly and collectively.
Yeah. Therese.
I was just going to say that I don't think the system that we grew up with was necessarily supportive of getting individuals out of the class that they were born into. And I think that we are having to try and rectify the changes and try to alleviate that cycle that individuals in society have been in, particularly ones that are underserved and have been consistently underserved. So that's part of why, we bring awareness to the Alice, we're bringing awareness to the Alice report, but then also some of the areas that are underserved in the state, white, rural, poor, but then also some of the areas that have issues such as transportation deserts, childcare deserts. I mean, the access to basic necessities for people has not been prioritized in that sense. If you live rural, the assumption is, well, you enjoy that. You didn't pick to live in a city because you don't really worry about transportation or connectivity or being part of the system. So the belief is that you're just consistently staying in that area, when part of what we're doing is to try to lift that up through legislation. So I agree with you. It's just my way of saying that I don't think sometimes the opinion is to try to rectify. It is just they chose to be where they are, and they are that.
Jeff, the Federal Reserve Bank plays a very important role in community and economic development. Speaking of transportation deserts, speaking of challenges with bank accounts, speaking with challenges with housing, how does the Federal Reserve Bank take the information that we're discussing today and incorporate it in its policy making at the regional level in the United States to help create opportunity for individuals?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that the Federal Reserve has several different roles. And the major role at the board where I am is the broad macroeconomic trends. And the Reserve Bank certainly have a much larger community development function. And I think of the way that works is through partnerships with various community development organizations and kind of understanding what the barriers to economic growth are on the ground. And so I think that that's where kind of things like the Alice findings, things like the Empire poll can be very helpful for really being able to recognize the challenges for New York State might not be the same as the challenges in North Carolina or the challenges in Oklahoma.
Mhm.
And being able to have this sort of information to then kind of help guide that community development effort, I think is really helpful, because it's always kind of allow the reserve banks to tailor their efforts and understand these are the unique challenges that workers are facing in a specific place, and then be able to work with the community leaders to figure out ways to overcome that.
Rusty, any closing thoughts?
Sure, I'll just double back to the previous question quickly. Part of sort of seeing how benefits for workers are benefits for everybody and improves society throughout. A lot of where we engage in these sort of cost benefit analyses and look at potential returns on investments of public dollars. That's done in a very isolated and siloed fashion. For example, if we think about the use of economic development subsidies to attract new firms, often we're using those for firms that are starting out by paying low wages or near minimum wage in some cases. And so they'll be included in that ALICE population. Many of them are also going to be eligible for public benefits like SNAP or Medicaid and Medicare. And so that's, as taxpayers, regular people are almost subsidizing those corporations on two ends. At the start, when they're opening up and being attracted into a location or a region, and then on the back end, when they're paying their workers wages that qualify them for other benefits that are taxpayer funded. And so as we're sort of moving funds around through the government, thinking about highest and best use for public dollars, looking at the complexity of those chains of interactions and connections is going to be very important, because what our polls are showing, and I'm sure there are others out there, is that there is broad public support for using public dollars for public services and for the public good. And the more that we filter those dollars into the private sector and into private hands, the less they're going to sort of make their way out and using the old trickle down logic and trickle down to everyone else. And so just taking a holistic look about at how we spend public dollars is going to take us forward in a different direction, I would hope.
Well, I just want to thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Therese. Thank you, Rusty, for an absolutely riveting, at least for me, discussion on these very important issues about what's happening at the household level in the United States and what we need to do to address this. We have a few takeaways. I think there's supposed to be a takeaway slide, but maybe not. But anyway, I'll just stop there and thank you. Oh, here it comes. Okay. So a few takeaways. Most New York State workers are struggling with rising costs of living, and a plurality feel worse off than a year ago. So we need to think about we need to engage elected officials on these issues. About 47% of New York households were below the ALICE threshold in 2023, making New York the 49th in the country. Nationally, financial well-being in 2024 was similar to the prior 2 years, but below the high of 2021. Inflation and prices continue to be a leading concern, and particularly the cost of childcare for parents. No single economic indicator can tell the full story, and we need a lot more to understand what's happening. Macroeconomic indicators are important, but a broader set of disaggregated economic measures and context matter for accurate interpretation. If that's the one thing we want to take away from this presentation, it's that, and that we need to understand what's happening at the household level to address the needs and concerns of Americans. So with that, I thank you all very much again for your time today, and thank the audience for joining us, and I wish you all very well.